Good afternoon, friends, colleagues. Good morning, our friends joining from the Americas. We're happy for this moment as we take a moment to reflect on what we are about to go through on this journey in the next 2 hours. I invite you all, brothers and sisters, to join me in raising our voices to the Lord this afternoon or this morning for those that are still early in the day. Let us pray. Loving God, we pray for healing to address the persistent sin of racism, which rejects the full humanity of some of your children and the talents and potential you have given. We pray for the grace to recognize the systems that do not support the dignity of every person, that do not promote respect for those who are seen as other, who bear the legacy of centuries of discrimination, fear, and violence. We pray for grace structures so children of color and all children have access to clean water and healthcare. We pray for grace structures so children of color and all children have quality education that will allow them to develop their gifts. We pray for graced structures so children of color and all children have homes where families can live in dignity and security. We pray for graced structures so children of color and all children can grow up without fear, without the sound of gunshots. Lord of all, we ask you to hear and answer our prayers. We pray for graced structures that will seek to undo the years of trauma caused by sinful and unjust acts. In receiving your divine healing, help us to be vessels of healing. In receiving your peace, make us instruments of peace. Give us eyes to see how the past has shaped the complex present and to perceive how we must create a new way forward with a new sense of community that embraces and celebrates the rich diversity of all, that helps us live out your call to reject the sin of racism, the stain of hate, and to seek a compassionate solidarity supported by your grace and your love. As we gather today for this important conversation, may the Spirit of truth guide us so that we are empowered to speak the truth of the past and present. Lead us continually along the pathway that leads towards reconciliation, justice, and peace. We ask this through Christ, the Prince of Peace and our Savior. Amen.
Good day, everyone. My name is Isabel Abao-Piri. I'm the Deputy General Secretary in the WCC, responsible for public witness and diaconia. The WCC is honored to host this pre-conference conversation on racism and Afrophobia in preparation for the Manchester Africa and Africans Conference. It will start on the 23rd to 29th October 2021. The WCC has a long history of engagement in overcoming racism. In fact, this month, we are also celebrating the 50th anniversary of the WCC's program to combat racism. In 1989, the former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, attended the WCC assembly in Harare. And at that conference, he addressed the audience and informed everyone that the program to combat racism was the most important program that contributed to the ending of apartheid in South Africa. And as we read the signs of our times, we realize that the racism is not over. And so the WCC has recommitted itself by bringing back the program, but this time it's a transversal in overcoming racism, in order to convene space for the churches to respond and act on the issue of overcoming racism. This pre-conference conversation is the third one in a series of 3. The first pre-conference conversation was on reparation and reparatory justice, which was held on 29th September 2021, organized by the Africa and Africans in the diaspora. They also organized a second pre-conference, and the topic of that one was the 4th Industrial Revolution. It was held on the 11th of October, 2021. So, with the third conversation on racism, we chose to have it in 2 sessions. One session was held this morning, European time, and it was meant to cater for participants from Africa, Europe, and Asia, and the Pacific. And for what is the afternoon session here for us in Geneva, it is targeting participants from the Americas, but also others from Europe and Africa. Today's conversation highlights that while there are political, economic, and religious spiritual manifestations of the deprivation and discrimination of Africa and Africans in the diaspora, there is no denying that racism as an attitude that bases itself on a false theory of hierarchies within the human race, in which the white race is considered superior to all others, to all other races, with the Black race being considered the least of all races, or even sub-race, is a transversal theme across all these dimensions. This centrality of racism in the experience of Africans on the continent or in the diaspora motivated the need for a pre-conference conversation on racism and its manifestations and how it is experienced by Africans in different regions of the world. It is my pleasure then to introduce to you the moderator of this session, the Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith. She is the Senior Associate for Pan-African and Orthodox Faith Engagement at Bread for the World in Washington, DC. And she brings extensive global, national, and local experience as a faith and public engagement thought leader, journalist, speaker, broadcaster, scholar, preacher, and author. President Clinton, Senior Richard Lugar, former Indiana Governor Mike Pence, and 2 of her alma mater, Yale University Divinity School and Kent State University, have awarded her with high distinctions of leadership. She received her doctorate degree from Princeton Theological Seminary and is former executive director, minister of the Church Council in Greater Indianapolis, Indiana, member of the Home Mission Board for the National Baptist Convention, USA, a World Council of Churches and National Council of Churches governing board member, a president of historic Black churches at one of the widest represented bodies of national churches and their related networks of Christianity in the USA, Christian Churches Together. Most recently, she was selected to be a member of the preparatory working group for the new United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. So over to you, Reverend Angelique Walker-Smith.
Well, Dr. Fury, thank you so much for your very generous regard in my space. And thank you so much for your leadership as our Deputy General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. And then also to Dr. Gunda for his beautiful prayer given by our dear colleague, Dr. Diombara Ngoroji. We are delighted to have been opened in such a systematic approach of prayer in this space. We are so grateful at the Africans and Diaspora Manchester Conference movement and conference that is coming up, where I serve as international co-convener, to be partnering yet again with the World Council of Churches and various partners who will bring this conference to fore, inshallah, God willing, within a week. We are truly honored that we will have various distinguished guests and presenters that will be there, and that this pre-conference allows us the space to be prepared for the conference to have the deeper substantive engagement. All of the pre-conferences that you have named and other regional conferences that have been held over the past 3 years since the formulation of this conferencing at the World Council of Churches Central Committee meeting at the Balsay Institute, I might add, where the genesis of this movement began. Some will know that whenever the governing body of the World Council of Churches comes together, that people of Africa and of African descent gather in our space to formulate, to contemplate, to pray together, rather to the weighty matters of the World Council of Churches. And so there is actually a long history that goes back to when Mr. Mandela was actually there in Harare, where the Reverend Sam Kobia, then our General Secretary, said at that assembly where Mr. Mandela, President Banana, and also Prime Minister Mugabe were there, said, this is a time where Africans in diaspora need to be brought together in 1998 at that time for this kind of coming together of Africans of African descent would come together. So this movement also has its history with what Dr. Fury has said relative to Mr. Mandela. He was there to champion our togetherness as well as the other leaders in question, and we have been meeting ever since. So there is actually a long history here, but of course the history predates that as well. And I just want to say a couple words about that in addition to the ecumenical history that I've mentioned. It was in 1938 that the Reverend Dr. Benjamin E. Mays and others around the world of Africa and African descent met together before the World Council of Churches actually became the World Council of Churches. We know the history that the World Council of Churches was supposed to have started before World War II, but World War II had to postpone the actual formulation of the World Council of Churches. So in the 30s, when the Student Federation was coming together and other missionary movements were coming together, where people of Africa and African descent were part of those earlier conversations that came on the heels of the missionary movement. In 1938 had this global meeting on racism. And it was in that ecumenical space. So although we speak of 1998, we speak of the program to combat racism, we actually also want to mention 1938. I am honored that the person that I follow on the Central Committee, Reverend Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, was my predecessor in my role now on Central Committee, and that he had much to do with that meeting in 1938. But just very quickly prior to that, and related also to the history in which we talk about this current issue, of course, was in 1884 around the scramble for Africa, where Africa was literally divided, and in that division of the continent with imperialist powers that made those decisions in Berlin, that moment, and also with the culmination of this quote missionary movement, and that's one reason why I'm glad Dr. Gruchley is here, we saw a response in the Pan-African space. And that response was in the 1900s with people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first PhD from Harvard University. Also with people like Patmos, Dr. Patmos from the Caribbean, and others who came together and made an announcement about this moment of the century, that racism, Du Bois is known for this statement, that racism would be the issue of that century. And so we want to remember that because, again, this conversation is couched around the history of the Pan-African Congresses that began in 1900. Of course, the movement that we're a part of now that moves to the conference within a week's time is really focused on 1945 in Manchester. And that particular Pan-African Congress is where the people like Du Bois, Patmos, and Nkrumah, President Nkrumah, and others that were noted at that time, he said, it is time to energize the independence movement of the continent of Africa. It was also pre-civil rights. Now, very quickly, although that should have happened in the 30s, but there was a deal made, of course, with President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, but that's another conversation for another day. So these postponements, but yet these reactions and these continual intellectual conversations did continue. And so today we are coming on a conversation that is on the heels of these movements where people came together like we're doing in this space to recalibrate and refocus and reimagine what does it mean to deal with the demon of racism. How do we approach this issue? I'm very pleased to be a part of this distinguished panel today, whereby these experts will lend their voices in their amazing profiles to this conversation. But more than this, I am very excited that we have attendees that are here who also represent voices in this space. And so we are delighted to welcome you to this moment. Very quickly, let me allow the time now to introduce our distinguished guests. We are so honored to have Dr. Dominique Day, who is an American attorney and has been admitted to the practice in New York. She sits on the United Nations Working Group of Experts of People of African Descent. She has 2 decades of experience as a justice advocate in the United States and globally. Her research, her teaching, and yes, access to justice work has taken her all over the world. Dr. Dominique has worked with governments, universities, national government organizations, NGOs, as a subject matter expert on legal aid, access to justice, building effective legal instruments, and human rights advocacy, and yes, the rule of law. Dr. Day, we are glad that you are here, and we will now want to introduce the other panelists who will come to us as well. We also welcome the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia A. Thompson. Dr. Karen Georgia is the Associate General Minister for the Wider Church Ministries and Operations in the United Church of Christ. And she is the co-executive for Global Ministries with the United Church of Christ and the Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ. She's been working with the UCC national setting for 12 years. And she's first as Minister of Racial Justice before assuming her role as Minister for Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations. She is also a member of the World Council of Churches Central Committee, and she also is a past ecumenical officer relative to the United Church of Christ. We also welcome today our colleague from the Council for World Mission. The Council of World Mission is a very important body in the life and work of the global community. And Dr. Peter Gushri is the person who handles mission development for the mission society there. The Council for World Mission is a worldwide partnership of Christian churches. The 32 members are committed to sharing their resources of money, people, skills, and insights globally to carry out God's mission locally. The CWM was created in 1977 and incorporates the London Missionary Society, circa 1795, the Commonwealth Missionary Society, 1836, and the English Presbyterian Board of Missions, 1847. So we have a very important wide breadth of expertise on this panel. And what delights me is that we have both the historical, all the way back to the 1700 perspectives that may be available to us in this moment, as well as I've spoken to, the issues of the 1800s and the 1900s in the Pan-African space, and then also the current moment. It's so important to know that this issue of racism has been with us for centuries, and that in this moment, we experience this demon again at this time. So without further ado, I would like to begin our agenda. And our agenda will be as follows. We will be opening the space for our panelists to have freedom to answer the questions that they've been given prior to, but also some space for spontaneity, for some engagement. So we'll begin with our first rubric around the issues of the questions. And then after we come through the 3 rubrics of questioning, we will come to the time of the Q&A. So let us begin the conversation. What are some of the current trends in the manifestation of racism and African experiences of racism? And how do the panelists view that? Each will be given up to 5 minutes to respond to that general open-ended question based on the questions they've been given in advance to respond. Let us go in the order of Professor Dr. Day, Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, and then to Dr. Boucher. In that order, please. Thank you. You're most welcome. And thank you again for being a part of this discussion.
I'd like to thank the World Council of Churches. It is always a great pleasure for us to join you, and the partnership and the solidarity and the engagement that we are able to experience with you as a member of as a chair of the working group is something that is it's deep and it's special and it's meaningful to us. So it's very much my pleasure to join you here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I think I'd like to answer that question with reference, or at least with an undercurrent of understanding that the commitments set forth in these spaces to confront and dismantle systemic racism have been serious, have been important, and yet continue to be necessary. I think today we see the issues and historical framings that Reverend Dr. Walker Smith has framed really well for us. These are sites that are important to acknowledge legacies of the past. We know that historically systemic, that racism and the construct of race was used to rationalize colonialism, trade and trafficking enslaved Africans by embedding justifications throughout the social fabric. And today we can look at virtually every area of society and we can measure not just racial disparities, but the ongoing use of discretion, the ongoing use of leadership to perpetuate racial disparities, right? And to call a spade, right? Systemic racism is made up not of a global misunderstood thing in the sky, but of the subjective decision-making of people with power, with people of people with small amounts of power or large amounts of power. And we see that it's perpetuated today. And maybe a few examples I can give. The one we obviously always have to start with right now because it is so pressing and it is so tragic is the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We've seen massive racial disparities in infections, in severity, in mortality, in community impact in COVID-19. And yet we knew that a lot of who is impacted by a pandemic, it relates to the social determinants of health. We knew that people of African descent, people of Latino descent, Afro-Latinos would be massively impacted by a pandemic. Research had been done on this in advance on H1N1 to say the next pandemic will also have a highly racialized impact. And yet this research was ignored. A lot of us remember a year and a half ago, as we started talking about what COVID-19 was and what it would look like, and the real disinclination to see this as a space to really escalate our efforts around racial justice. When I say our, I want to talk about decision makers in public health spaces. We understood that, yes, there was a virus that was infectious to everybody, and yet the likelihood that it would devastate Black and Brown communities was seen as something not to be thought of or proactively dealt with. And instead, racial disparities in the COVID space played out predictably, and yet without real concern on the front end. So, where does this leave us? And, we reported on this about a year ago. It leaves us with one conclusion that's really key and that should carry us forward, which is that COVID is not exclusively a public health issue, where it's policy decisions that fail to prioritize scientific conclusions and also reflect racialized priorities. Just as things like police violence against Black bodies is not exclusively a policing issue, where widespread impunity, misconduct, and brutality exist within an within an enabling environment of racialized misconduct. And so with COVID, we know, for example, that states ignored the early indications of racial disparity. We offered guidance on this, you offered guidance on this. It was not really embedded into policymaking decisions. But there's research done during the pandemic. This is a really amazing paper, we've been reporting on it a lot, that reparations alone, reparations after the period of enslavement, would have decreased the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic by 31 to 68% in certain parts of the United States. This is research that's done around Louisiana, where, interestingly enough, we also have had heavy focus this year looking at the climate crisis, environmental racism, and the invisibility of the impacts of people of African descent in this space. So when we look at where toxic waste is being cited, when we look at who is being impacted by climate change, when we look at how policymakers are even construing their own role to combat both climate crisis and to acknowledge environmental racism, we see consistently that people of African descent are somehow instrumentalized as tools of the process rather than primary objects of governance, primary objects of citizenship rights. And this is a conversation that continues. I don't want to go over my time. I'm not sure if I'm saying a little too much, but even at this point, we see that vaccine equity conversations are grounded in this idea of morality and humanitarian need, rather than in a discourse of rights or legal obligation, right? We see massive disparities in who was able to even access treatment, who was able to access vaccine, who was able to access this gradual reopening of the global stage, when the international community itself has really failed people of African descent on a global level right now. And even that conversation is not being held in terms of holding certain countries, holding wealthy spaces accountable for the incredibly self-involved and self-interested behavior that we've seen over the last year. Instead, there's a conversation about the donation or the giving or the provision of vaccine, rather than the importance of both the right to health and the nature of international community, where interdependence is the foundation of rights, rather than a foundation of mere moral preference. And this is a space that continues to make us ask, are our institutions, including our intergovernmental and international institutions, are these operating consistently with or contrary to their design? When we can look at something like the climate crisis, when we can look at environmental racism, where we can look at COVID-19 and consistently see people of African descent not just ignored in the process, but devastated by these spaces. And as our sort of introductory remarks sort of offered us, the connection to history, the through line of race that really seems to dictate how decision making plays out in these spaces, how people get prioritized, how people get seen, that's unavoidable. And so maybe this is maybe I'll leave it there, if that's okay. I feel like I'm a little bit over, but I do really welcome this conversation.
Professor Day, thank you so much for those remarks. I would like to turn the floor over to the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you. So far, Angelique, WCC, and Dominique for your remarks in this as well. I'm also thankful for this space that has been created to carry forward this dialogue, which is so important among us. Dominique picked up on a number of issues, COVID-19, and I think that's the biggest space right now where we're seeing so much disparity, and it ties so much to what is this global phenomenon of racism. The history, I think, which has been touched on here, is so important as a part of the ongoing narrative, because it has been foundational in creating what we currently see. So we touched a little bit on the enslavement of Africans, touched a little bit on colonialism, and all of that begins to play out generationally in what we see. I certainly come to this as from my own personal experiences, walking this world as a Black woman, and what it means to be in this space where people look at you and treat you a certain kind of way just based on what they see. That's what racism is. I think in our current trends, what we are seeing, yes, is COVID-19. We're also seeing this rabid nationalism, which also is pushing into spaces around racism and inequities, particularly when we talk about issues around immigration and migration, and how people from certain parts of the world are received or not in particular spaces as people migrate. I think that the nationalism that we're seeing, certainly here in the United States, in parts of Europe, has been incredibly anti-Black. It has also fueled, I think, what has always been present in terms of prejudice and overt racist policies that continue to disenfranchise Black communities. I think that's a part of the trend that we're seeing. I think for a long time, there seemed to be this polite silence around racism, almost this sense of disbelief that racism actually still existed. And then all of a sudden, there's just this public way in which remarks from political figures are not as nuanced or parsed. They are very, very clear in their racist construct. Dominique kind of alluded to some of that in her remarks, because those places of power and positions of power do begin to frame and to shape how public discourse then comes around racism. I think the militarization of our cities is also a global phenomenon. I think it's not just, and I don't want to say just because that seems pejorative, it's a phenomenon that is beyond the issue of policing and violence, right? It's a way in which communities, Black communities, are being checked, if you will, because some of what we see in terms of a high police presence, the spending of dollars on weaponizing our cities, is a part of what it means, I think, to disenfranchise communities, to declare them as unsafe. There are other places in our world that are not policed in the same way. don't experience the same kinds of violence to body, mind, and spirit, and the trauma that is experienced in these communities. I think there's also escalating fear that also, I think, in some ways relates to the fact that the global South is growing, whereas the global North is not. So when we want to talk about population distribution, the growth is in areas where there is a perceived fear of the other, right? So so all of a sudden we start seeing walls going up, doors closing, because it's a way of keeping out. And so our policies are also perpetuating this this current trend that we're seeing. The last thing I want to mention, particularly because I live in this region, I'm a daughter of the Caribbean. I was born in Jamaica. I want to talk a little bit about Haiti, and what we're seeing, particularly on the U.S. border, in terms of the crisis with Haitians trying to come into the United States, and the United States making a decision to turn Haitians back. The policies of the United States historically have been racist when it comes to the inclusion of Haitians or receiving Haitians in this country. It has always been that way. And what we're seeing is a resurgence, even amidst the political crisis that is present in Haiti. The ways in which the Haitian economy has suffered because Haiti dared to do what others did not. Haiti succeeded in gaining its independence in the 1700s, at a time when colonization was rampant and Africans were enslaved in the Caribbean. They dared to emancipate themselves, and they have paid the price. And it's something that we need to acknowledge. It continues to be racist, racist policies, a racist way of dealing, not just with an individual, but with an entire country of people. I will stop there and just thank you for the opportunity to be present.
Dr. Karen, Georgia, I just got to say hallelujah and Ashe about Haiti. I'm sorry, just got to stop and pause. Thank you so much for raising Haiti in this moment. That has to be said, particularly given the Pan-African nature of the Congresses that were all about independence. And to remember that Haiti in the 1700s already had lifted his voice, and yes, in that moment was successful. So let us just thank God for that remembrance. For you and Professor Day, thank you both for all of the comments you've offered so far. You've given us a great grounding to go forward. Dr. Gruchley, your turn. You are representing an agency that goes all the way back to the 1700s. The Haiti piece was a great transition into the 1700s, the 1800s, which you represent. So Dr. Gruchley, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, friends, for an opportunity to share, undeserved space being made for me to sit amongst you, and I hope to share, but more importantly, to learn. I want to speak from and to my own whiteness, but also, as Dr. Angelique has pointed out, I work for an organization, a mission organization that roots itself back into the 18th century, and an organization in reshaping itself in the 1970s to decolonize itself has found itself challenged to address again our colonial past and its resonances and presence in our lives still. And through a project called The Legacies of Slavery, are trying to face these things together, and would like to recognize and thank Karen Georgia, who was an important part of the legacies of slavery hearings and core group to lead us and challenge us. So let me say a few things, if I may, in the context of this conversation around, maybe really around whiteness, for white colleagues who, like me, are responsible both for the sin of Cain and the sin of Abel when it comes to racism as being both perpetrators of violence and also indifferent to those who are the recipients of violence, and how we engage in this. So that's really my hope in our conversations today, only to share some of these things and not to speak into the realities of anti-Black racism as they're being described to us by Black colleagues. But I want to notice a few things, and also some of their historical resonances perhaps in our story. In the response to things like Black Lives Matter, then, you know, white people have been allegedly seeking to show their anti-racist credentials. And Black colleagues are naming again, we saw in Europe in the recent European Soccer Championships, Black footballers speaking out, saying how it is that when Black colleagues perform well, they are applauded and their success is acknowledged for the nation. But when failure comes, they are blamed for their race. And this representative role, this sort of huge pressure on Black colleagues particularly to speak into racism and represent justice and transformation is enormous. And I'm reminded of a figure in the story of the London Missionary Society called Cupido. And Cupido was a Khoikhoi convert to Christianity. He is the earliest indigenous evangelist within the London Missionary Society. And he's paraded in front of the London Missionary Society supporters in 1805 as that great example of what, you know, the gospel civilizing a Black person. Look, see how amazing this man is, you know. And Cupido is the first indigenous evangelist to be given a mission station of his own. And there are pictures of him, and he's celebrated, let's say. Naturally, he encounters huge persecution from Boer settlers, from fellow white missionaries, and because the station he is sent to is in disputed territory, it is constantly overrun by Boer settlers and by indigenous tribes. And in that sense, his mission station does not do well. And so what happens is that the great London Missionary Society hero of Africa, Robert Moffat, sacks him. And Cupido is sacked, and he dies in poverty, forgotten by the London Missionary Society, who never paid him. So this sense of repeating history is important for white colleagues like myself to recognize, who in seeing the analysis of racism today keep saying, we aren't like that. But yet our history keeps showing that we are. We've recently begun work on children and racism and Christian education materials, and looking at how the London Missionary Society used Christian education materials to propagate racist views of the world and teach white children, white working class children especially, to believe in their own innate supremacy. And we've been talking to Christian education providers now to ask them to assess their own work and how their work and their materials advocate anti-racism or not. And with our researcher, they've been saying, oh, we're really glad you've raised this question. You know, please could you give us some Black writers who might contribute to our materials? And my Black colleague said to her, they asked me the same question 10 years ago. Nothing changed. And even within the context of reparation, this is where I really want to just finish, even where movements, even like my own movement, are talking about reparation, how reparation is being still used as a means to reinscribe the institutions who, in apologizing, are using their funds and the publicity that comes with these statements to recenter themselves and co-opt people into their space. So I want to acknowledge, as I say, as a white colleague, that in the liberation work that Black colleagues are leading, the backlash that comes to them, and of course how white receptivity can be deeply deceptive. I'm curious as this work develops at the World Council of Churches in how whiteness and white institutional power will continue to be critiqued. Dr. Angelique, I'd like to hand back to you.
Dr. Crucially, thank you so much for those remarks and for taking us back in history and then also clarifying a part of the narrative with our indigenous brothers and sisters relative to the history of racism. And of course, we want to be very clear that racism crosses various racial ethnic groups in the world. We're focusing in on the Pan-African, those of African descent and Africa in this space, but we certainly always are in solidarity with what is happening with all of our brothers and sisters when it comes to the issue, the evil of racism. And thank you too for what you are doing relative to ensuring that the narratives are being shared out of the history to which all of us are children of, and also need to hold up in a way of being scrutinized in this moment. So thank you so much for being here to help us with that. Let us move now to the second round of conversation around the issue of unpacking anti-Black racism and Afrophobia. Can each of you help us unpack what that really means? That not only the definition, many of you have spoken about the actual cases, if you will, the narrative that's in our society from COVID and all the other things that have been named, but help us to unpack what we are really saying when we talk about anti-Black racism and Afrophobia. Help us to have a deeper understanding of those terms and that understanding. And I'm going to start with Dr. Karen Georgia this time, and then I'm going to go to Professor Day, and then go back to Dr. Gruchley. So over to you.
Thank you. And Peter, thank you for your remarks, and particularly your remarks about whiteness. And I think that also speaks to privilege and the ways in which what has always been dominant culture, which is not about population, but a dominant narrative, has been particularly destructive, even with the missional imperative, which walked hand in hand with colonialism. But I want to name and start with the fact that anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism, and Afrophobia are not problems that are created by African and African descent people. Those are constructs and narratives that attempt to victimize, to denigrate, and to render dignity, freedom, and respect as rights that are not to be had by a particular people and community. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the lack of dignity and respect that is afforded to people of African and African descent when we talk particularly about those two things. I think that when we talk about anti-Black racism, it's a particular distinction because racism, and particularly all forms of discrimination are rampant, right? So anti-Black racism is particular, and it speaks to the discrimination, the prejudice, the institutional ways in which Blacks, and I'm talking here about people of African descent and Africans, are disenfranchised and marginalized within the communities in which they live. And even when we look globally, there has been that directed at the African continent, and in particular to the sub-Saharan African countries. Anti-Black racism is what we've been talking about. It's the ways in which the race identified as Black, which is a particular group of people, continue to experience some of what we've already talked about. It's about community. Afrophobia is really that fear of Africanness, which is also in some ways, I guess, has become synonymous with Blackness, Africanness, Blackness. But Afrophobia is really the hatred or the fear of all things African, which is not just about now racism, but it's also about culture. It's about spiritual practices. It's about all of what it means to hold African as a part of identity, right? So we're here in the space of the World Council of Churches. Peter just talked very eloquently about mission. And a part of what mission did into to Africa, to African peoples, even people who were enslaved, was it denied, one, that we were people. It talked about our absence of souls, problematic. It also problematized the ways in which we understood God and the spirituality that our ancestors carried, which were themselves valid expressions and understandings of the divine. God is multiply revealed among us. And so the denial of the spirituality, the heritage, the culture, what we look like, who we are, is a part of that Afrophobia. It's about our hair, it's about what we eat, it's about how we live, it's about where we go, it's about what we do, that is framed, and it says who we are is problematic to someone else, because guess what? This is how God made us. This is who we are. This is who I am. I am not a problem. Afrophobia is a problem. Anti-Black racism is a problem. And in order to get at that, we need to continue to interrogate whiteness. We need to continue to interrogate and call out white privilege and other ways in which privilege manifests itself and continues to marginalize others in community. And lastly, we need to continue to really call out and call for change when it comes to exactly what Peter said in his last words, whiteness and white institutional power.
Thank you so much for especially clarifying the distinctions, We really want to appreciate that. Professor Day, over to you to follow up as well. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And I'm hoping this actually will build on what both Karen, Georgia, and Peter have said. I'd like to share a few slides if that's okay, because I wanted to offer, I think in this section, a few specific ideas. I did some presentations to member states with the same idea and thought maybe they could be useful here as well. So I'm going to share my screen.
Thank you.
And really, I hope you understand that just with a real deep appreciation for what we've heard in the last 15 minutes, which I think is amazing. I'm going to try to go through these very quickly, but they're all specific examples. So let me just start this slideshow. So, when we're talking about unpacking Afrophobia, unpacking anti-Blackness, I'm going to offer maybe a little bit of a complicated conversation about Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, whom hopefully most of you have heard about. She is the researcher behind the Moderna vaccine. She, single-handedly has saved and will save probably billions of people. She's a woman of African descent. She grew up in rural North Carolina. And by all accounts of every teacher she ever had, she was one of the most brilliant students they'd ever seen. She was an uncommon child in that space, and they all did everything they could to lift her up. All of that lifting, all of that recognizing, all of that exceptionalism, right, results in her being able to go to college and get her graduate degree in North Carolina, right? It doesn't even make it outside of the state, which I'm not denying that she is a privileged person among us. And yet, right, she ultimately goes to school in North Carolina, very good schools, and becomes a researcher for the government. And she's researching mRNA. Nobody's funding it. She's getting no recognition. She's not teaching at fancy schools. And then COVID happens. And in a weekend, she goes home and develops the basic framework for the vaccine that is, at this moment, testing the best, working the best, producing the best immunities that we have on the market. In a weekend, she does this. And today she's teaching at Harvard, right? All of a sudden we can see her, now that she's saved 1 billion white lives, we can see her and offer her a space in the elite spaces of academia and of research. And at the same time, if you look at her Twitter, if we look at her history, she's the first person to point out that her research, her excellence, the people like her who are working hard in these spaces were often invisible, that she was not seen as a contender by those in her field. She was working for the government. That says something for a researcher, right? And ultimately it took her developing a vaccine that quite literally saves the world for her to be seen in her excellence, right? It begs the question of, is the next Dr. Corbett visible and being supported and being lifted up? Or is it a function of luck, as it was with this Dr. Corbett? When we talk about unpacking Afrophobia, unpacking anti-Blackness, a good place to start is someone like this, who up until a year ago was invisible, was overlooked, even in conferences in her own field, was not necessarily taken very seriously, until in fact she spent a weekend curing COVID or vaccinating against COVID. This isn't small, right? It's a story about an exceptional person, but an exceptional person who was consistently rendered ordinary through the decision-making of people with subjective amounts of power, but not necessarily tremendous insight, right? Because their insight in itself was built on white supremacy, right? So to see her as excellent required her to do something so extraordinary that it was unthinkable. To see her as excellent required her to show up in a way that shook loose the foundations of white supremacy that really governs decision-making in powerful spaces. So I'm going to keep moving. I feel like I'm already a little bit over my time, but I have a few more cases I'd like to just throw, and I can even save some of them to the next block. So please interrupt me, Angelique, if there's at the point you want me to stop.
2 minutes at this point. Thanks.
Sorry, should I stop now?
No, 2 more minutes. Just want to give you a heads up.
Okay. You know, another space where I'm talking about what Afrophobia looks like, and thank you so much, Karen Georgia, for offering a really powerful framing of this before, is policy with respect to Haiti, right? We have people who are inside the country, people who should have the right to apply for asylum, if we're talking about legal rights, people whose economic instability and personal tragedy has been exacerbated by US policy over and over, including right after the last earthquake 10 years ago, where we saw not just ineffective, but absolutely destructive interventions producing cholera, producing ineffective or just non-existent redevelopment, right? We saw a political coup that just took place. You've seen 2 US advisors resign, wondering what actually is the backstory here. And we've seen a denial of the right to asylum under this Title 42, which is like the 42 US code, a public health provision in Title 42 that is suggesting that the US has the right to expel or possibly refool refugees, right, who, because of a public health crisis. Now, I think what we know is that all the vaccine exists in this country. We've seen massive vaccine tourism from wealthy people in Latin America and the Caribbean who fly in, need to show no ID, are able to get vaccinated. And you know what, that's great. I feel like let everyone get as much vaccine as they can. But instead of literally refouling people, putting them on planes, sending them back to Haiti, not even telling them what's happening or what they're doing, we don't choose under the public health concern that we're using to refool them. We don't choose to vaccinate them. We don't choose to test them. We don't choose to offer them structures to prevent COVID or other things. We don't even choose to find out if they're facing the kind of persecution that refoulement might expose them to certain death. Instead, we see, as you see here, men on horseback using whips to rein in Haitians. And as I've been saying quite a lot lately, for those of us who see Alvin Ailey as a deeply spiritual space, as Alvin Ailey said about Revelations, there's something about this that makes our blood memories quake, right? He says he wrote Revelations, a famous ballet about enslavement, from his blood memories. And this is a space where we look at these pictures and we see lynch mobs, we see slave patrols, we understand the inclination to behave like this toward Black bodies has something to do with history, with racism, the construct of race. We understand that the tolerance of this and the license to keep refouling has something to do with race. And when we look at Afrophobia and anti-Blackness, these pictures tell you that the exercise of discretion, the use of power, the way people see options has a lot to do with the race of the people that they see as the objects of their interactions. So maybe I'll stop there. I can do a few more later. Does that make sense?
I just want to thank you, Attorney Day, for those powerful illustrations of what these terms really mean. Thank you so much. And in the chat, I'm sure you'll see there's a lot of echo of support relative to these illustrations that are today. I mean, this is what is so astounding. We're not looking at images or stories of the early 1900s or the late 1800s or the mid 1900s. No, this is 2021. And I just think the power of now, where we are experiencing these glowing, glaring illustrations of what we are talking about in this moment, is just so powerful. Thank you both so much again. Over to you, Dr. Grushin. Thank you.
I want to carry on, I guess, some of my reflection from where I spoke a moment ago. And I think as we talk about unpacking anti-Black racism and Afrophobia, then we have to place it within the context of the fundamental violence at the heart of whiteness. 400 years of white violence. I spoke a moment ago about the sin of Cain and the sin of Abel as being simultaneously sort of marking out whiteness as a system, as a structure. And certainly that's what we are seeing. So I want to talk about how anti-Black racism flows out of economic violence. Now, in terms of the contemporary setting, in the light of COVID, in the light of the financial crash 2007, 2008, we are seeing, as Dominique and Karen Georgia named earlier on, the emergence of ultra-nationalisms, right-wing violence in many locations, in mine own in Europe especially. Economic violence powers racism, not just in terms of its manifestations today, but in its heart, in the very shape and nature of economics and the economic system that continues to violate and has violated for 400 years African and African descendant communities and more, and of course the earth herself. So as we begin to unpack this, I think fundamentally, not just to name whiteness, which we need to do, but to name capitalism itself as a child of colonialism, and how it's gone on to kind of further privilege particular nations and people within particular nations. So for me, this is a key part of the work that needs to be done to address. So there is economic violence. And then, of course, as we already heard, there is the spiritual violence, the Christian violence, or the violence of Christian identity. Now, I don't want to be the white person who quotes Frantz Fanon but even so, I'm going to quote Frantz Fanon, who talks about Europe as the product of Africa, that Europe is created out of Africa's resources. And this is an important critique back from the 1920s. And it's not just true of Europe, it's true of the mission agencies of Europe, who also harnessed anti-Black racism to financialize their work. So for my own organization, in the materials we produce, the imagery especially, racism is used to make money for our organizations and to stir missionaries to act in pity, in concern, in love, etc. And so within that complex of the violence of Christian identity, the violence of economics, there is also an ongoing anxiety I see within whiteness, particularly within British whiteness and particularly within Christian whiteness, around solidarities. And as we talk about race without factoring in class and inequality, there is an issue there for me. And I was looking, as I prepared for this, at the writings of Sarah Parker Redmond, African-American abolitionist, who came to the UK in 1859 to visit the Lancashire cotton mills, to speak to them about the conditions in which cotton was produced, and of course, the conditions in which these workers were working. And my own mission organization is centered in a class struggle. I know this is unpopular language these days, but in the Victorian era, mission movements were very much about improving the white working class, but using the white working class in a similar way. And actually how the manufacturing and confecting of anti-Black racism is about preventing solidarities of exploited people to transform and liberate. And so it's no surprise that whenever we see the movements of liberation make progress, even as we're seeing with Black Lives Matter, why then there is such an important, white lash that comes, and naming Haiti is so important for this. So I want to finish quickly, if you like, to notice then the historical violence that's being done and the way that ideologies are used to prop up anti-Black racism. So in my own context now, this kind of work on legacies is being pushed back as a war on woke, as white people seek once again to revise history. We had comfortably rewritten the history of enslavement as being the story of white abolition. And now people are coming to tell the truth of how long it took. And so economics is at stake in all of this work. Christian identity is at stake. History and truth is all at stake. So in the context of this unpacking of anti-Black racism, I particularly want to notice how mission is at the heart of white, global, national and local social engineering. How the white gaze, the white desire has been driven into all of our systems. So that I prefer my violence, like I've said this before, I'm middle class, so I prefer my violence to be systemic. I don't engage in personal violence. But my whiteness is nailed there in that space. And in it drives this convenience of racism, and especially of anti-Black racism. Back to you, Dr. Angelique, back to you.
Dr. Gruchley, thank you so much for reminding us of the power behind violence and militarization, economic power, that all mitigate against our being able to address racism. And that is actually at the very foundation of where racism finds its definition as well. And then, of course, this spirit, this whole spirit of greed and sense of privilege that works against the interests of people of African descent and of Africa. And of course, other groups that we can name, but in this moment, we're naming anti-Blackness and racism, particularly in communities of Africa and African descent. So thank you for mentioning the principalities and powers that infuse and define what we mean by racism anti-Black racism and Afrophobia. Thanks to all three of you. There is one question in the chat that I do want to entertain before we transition into our next section. And it says to all the panelists, how could we respond to the historic and contemporary cases of hostility and prejudice among people of African origin in Africa and the African diaspora? Let me just pause here. I just want to name that question. It is in the chat. But I do think that the next section of our discussion will begin to address some of these things as we talk about the sixth region of the African Union and the Permanent Forum. But maybe just a brief comment, because it has come up during this time, excuse me, this time of presentation that can help transition into our next section of conversation. Dr. Gruchley, I'll start with you, then Professor Day, Dr. Karen Georgia, briefly, if you want to offer any comment to this specific question of our guest today.
Thank you. Again, as a white colleague responding, one has to respond in shame and determination in the context of repentance and reparation. So those, I think, are the fundamental things that organizations and individuals acknowledging this need to bring together. So those are things I would quickly name.
Thank you very much, Professor Day, and then Dr. Karen Georgia.
Thank you for this question. I'm going to actually build on what Peter was saying earlier, using Fanon, right? This idea of we are in a space where to be exceptional, to succeed, we have to somehow leave behind our community. And Dr. Brittany Cooper has said very powerfully, like, I don't actually want to sit at a table that requires me to abandon everybody in my life. But what Fanon says, right, is that as we get educated, as we see options, we're also asked to lose, to disdain our local cultural originality, to look at the people around us and see them as backward, as primitive, as less than. And ultimately, a condition of our excellence, a condition of our exceptionalism in the framing of a colonial education system and the framing of white supremacy is to ultimately, sooner or later, even as Black people, right, if we actually want to prove our entitlement to be at the white table, is to look at those in our own community, the places we came from, and understand that they are less than, not that their narratives, their expertise, and their entitlements are equal to anybody else's. And so I appreciate that question, because I spent a lot of time talking about how we too are educated into white supremacy. We too need to battle the ways that we've been taught that our own communities somehow are responsible for the devastation and destruction of exploitation that they continue to experience even today.
Thank you. And I just want to just add a few comments both to what Peter and Dominique have said. And I just want to add two things, because this is actually a much longer conversation to actually, I think, ably respond to this question. Because I think that, we're talking about over 400 years of intentional oppression. And so we probably need that much to even talk about how to begin to respond. But I want to say two things. I think one, as African and African descendant people, we need to find our way to a comprehensive narrative in telling our story about racial injustice. That thing about, united we stand, divided we fall is true. And what's challenging is that in some of our communities, we don't understand the far-reaching nature of racism and injustice and how that begins to play out globally, particularly when we talk about the education system, which Dominique talked about a little bit, but the ways in which education has been used as a tool to ensure that we are not able advocates. So if we don't know the story, then we can't really ask for the response that we need. And the response that we need really is for communities that perpetuate violence and the institutions that continue to uphold what we see in institutional racism and the political system that continues to perpetuate what we have seen for 400 plus years. We need for that to stop, right? So we could talk about Black empowerment, we could talk about Black Lives Matters as a movement. If we're not talking about how those things are created and not looking at restitution, reparations, we also need to talk about reparatory justice, which includes reparations, but is beyond that. So in that conversation, we might begin to get to the response that we need, but we can't just talk about the problem. We have to talk about where the problem is coming from. We can't just talk about empowering ourselves, because we can empower ourselves, but it doesn't change racism, because we as people of color, as Black people, don't perpetuate that injustice. And I should add, last point, Angelique, and I give it back to you. We really need to have a serious conversation about white fragility, because white people need to be able to hear that they are a part of the problem and attend to what it takes, even in Christian community, to begin to alleviate the suffering that we're seeing in Black communities as a result of the historic nature of racism and racial injustice.
Thank you, all three of you, for going straight to the point, being substantive, and helping us to transition into the next period of our time together. I want to say to everyone who's been kind enough to give of your time to be here today, please put your questions in the chat. Please, some have taken the initiative to do that. Others have shared their reflections. We invite and embrace these reflections for all who are in attendance. This is why we are here. We do have a panel of experts, but we also have you in the room, and you're experts in your own regard. So please, let's keep the energy going. Thank you so much for those who have initiated this. We will have a Q&A period after the last two questions, which are forthcoming in this moment. Now, speaking of how do we address these issues, there is a formulation that has come now from the African Union, to which we are grateful, that has espoused in its 2063 plan that engages the Sustainable Development Goals and a way forward for the continent to move forward. Within the last couple of years, the adoption of the Africa Free Trade Agreement has been made. There are discussions around issues of transportation, mobility, economic enterprise. There's the AGOA, the African Growth Opportunity Act, relative to the US and Africa. There are all these discussions now about agribusiness, et cetera, on the continent, of a way forward for the continent around policies and prosperity on the continent. However, for people of African descent to know that it's not just continental, but that this is a full embrace of people of African descent with the continent, wherever we may be, this sixth region is really quite important as we think about the Pan-African space, and certainly what the Pan-African Congresses were envisioning as early as the early 1900s, and in this moment as we move to the conference within a week's time. I'd be very interested to hear the response from the panelists around this initiative, not just the 2063, but particularly the sixth region and Africa finding this new space together under agency and self-determination. There's also a Marshall Plan that is being discussed relative to these issues as well. And then we'll conclude, not in this one, but we will conclude with the question about the permanent forum. But for now, let's focus on the continental Pan-African space that is being shaped in this moment. Let us begin with Professor Day and then Dr. Karen Georgia, and then we go over to Professor Grucci, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I really welcome this question and this engagement. I think this is a good opportunity to share some of what we've seen in our country visits, if I can share a few more slides. And again, I will ask you to interrupt me if I'm taking up a little too much time or a little too much space.
Please do, thank you.
Because, you know, this very question of how do we see, hold on, anti-Black racism playing out in development and economic engines is huge. I'm not doing so well with the multitasking. Okay, here we go. So hopefully you can see the slide. I think in this space, we've seen in our country visits a real reflection, and you know what, I'm actually gonna start with the third one first. A real reflection of how people of African descent have had to navigate anti-Black racism and a real disinclination to see them as partners in economic development over time. And so from our country visit to Peru, which took place immediately before the pandemic, one of the most interesting things we did was talk to mango farmers in Peru. We didn't know this so much in advance, but mangoes were brought to Peru by people of African descent during the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans. Today, we have a $60 to $80 million industry of mangoes in Peru. If you've been to Peru, I've never had a better mango than in Peru, except for maybe Pakistani mangoes, but huge, sweet, wonderful. But you can't grow a mango from a seed. You have to grow it from a live plant. And the technology, the intellectual capital, the intellectual property, the mechanisms of how to actually stand up and build a mango industry, these were all brought to Peru and to the New World generally by people of African descent in the transatlantic slave trade, right? So you have something where an entire industry has been brought to the Americas as an element of the exploitation and trafficking of Black folk, and yet the profit associated with that industry in no way reflects that. In Peru, we found that people of African descent were the ones growing. They had this fantastic sell $1 a mango. And then there would be these escalating profits later on, right? Even to purchase the mango in the store, you might spend 10 times that. But certainly mango products, mango essences, mango jams, right? Like anything you might see. And then obviously the export industry, or the $60 to $80 million is the export industry. These are all in the hands of non-Black folk, even though this entire industry was created by Black folk. And in fact, even the most basic investment to stabilize the product was never made. And so you don't see people there having gone to business school or having gone to agricultural school to enhance their ability to think about how to better make the product. You don't see irrigation. People are literally growing mangoes through traditional methods. If there's no rain, there's no product, or they carry water. And so it was really interesting to see this pretty substantial industry, an amazing product, a direct connection to the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans, and yet also an entire absence of state development, of economic development, of any kind of incentivizing or building of this industry. And in fact, the Black farmers were asking for very little, right? They were asking for an ability to sell their own mangoes and make jams and do things that they could sell at the farmers market. They were asking for irrigation. They weren't asking to be the importers and exporters of mango, but they were asking to look at the fact that they had actually brought this technology, which was continued to be used and exploited. Another example in Belgium. This is sort of the other end of the development scale. We saw that children of African descent were overwhelmingly redirected to vocational education, so pushed out of the university-bound system. We saw even with parents who had gone to university, parents who had PhDs, parents with graduate degrees, children almost universally, we heard this in every single place we went to. We heard it from every single parent of African descent. We're being pushed out of university education. The only positive story we heard was one person who had yanked her child out and paid for private school. We met children who had somehow navigated this and were in the university system, who were constantly being told by professors that they didn't belong there. And constantly, one of them had offered one of her papers under somebody else's name and got a better grade, right? So constantly being delegitimized just for who they were. The teachers, right? This again is subjective decision-making by people with a little bit of power. Teachers were routinely sending Black kids to vocational school and also threatening their parents with police action if they sought reconsideration, threatening them with child protection. And parents, even with strong interest in their children's education and advanced education, were unable to influence even their own children's fate within this system, right? So again, we're seeing, I've heard the themes today about education, colonial education, missionary education, but we're seeing a space where education, which we see as the pivot for us, right? A lot of us look at education as the way to really stimulate the way forward. This was something that was being wholesale denied in a country that considers itself the leader on human rights. This was a 2019 country visit that we made. Angelique, do I have time for one more quick example?
Unless it's within 1 minute, you do.
Okay,
Because
okay.
we're just a bit behind. Thanks so much.
The very last one, I'm going back to Peru in 2020. A bunch of farmers came to see us, driving hours. There was no bridge. These were people who were like sharecroppers. They would lease their land, and they were forced to lease their land in US dollars, but they were paid for their yield in Peruvian currency. So these are people who are working more than sun up to sundown, and ultimately we're being exploited by agribusiness, by transnational corporations, as we were talking about earlier in the introductory remarks, that are setting up like massively powerful decision-making spaces. They talked about how their wells were being leached by the company, which could drill deeper. But what they were asking for was just some predictability, right? Ultimately, they were forced into these unconscionable coercive contracts where they ultimately were paid in a space that ended up being less money and highly volatile, but they were responsible for the same high bar of US dollar, of US currency equivalent in order to lease their lands. And again, the state was not providing oversight. They were largely invisible even to civil society. And this is a space where agribusiness itself was exploiting people with very little intervention on anybody's part. And right, these farmers weren't, but they had a very clear understanding of both the racism and the injustice that was happening here. So I guess I'll end that point to say I appreciate this sort of intervention, and also want to highlight the expertise of how these things play out exist within these communities themselves. And I have, as you know, the extraordinary privilege of being able to make country visits and go and talk to people and then try to amplify their words in spaces like this. So thank you.
Professor Day, thank you so much for giving those concrete illustrations of how people of African descent are actually naming their own heritage, their own history, claiming their narrative against the colonized educational paradigms. Yeah, that people of African descent are saying, yes, we are people of African descent, and that there is now a space for that to be affirmed, not only in Peru or in Belgium, but in the Pan-African space, in the global space. I think this is significant, really. It's almost, if you will, going to the future from the past, if you will, that we're saying that over 400 years, yeah, there was synergy around identity, synergy around diversities within our identity. I mean, again, that's also the colonial narrative that somehow all Africans are all the same. I mean, come on. I mean, what is it? Over 52, 54 countries on the continent of Africa? And all the people of
Africa. And they deliberately mixed us up, so they know.
And they're exactly right. So this, to know that in Peru, in Belgium, and other places which you've been privileged to do this kind of analysis, people are saying we're creating our own narrative. We're owning our own truths. we are creating and owning what it is that we have the ability and the agency to lead. It is very powerful. So as we think about this sixth region of the African Union, and to know that these redefinitions, this renaming is embraced as part of the sixth region of the African Union is really quite powerful. So thank you for those illustrations and leading us into what may be renewed possibilities going forward. Over to you, Dr. Karen Georgia, and then also to you, Dr. Gruchley, and then we'll move quickly into the permanent forum. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just really appreciated those examples about the ways in which communities are doing this work and are living into a different narrative. I want to speak a little bit more broadly, so I'm glad that those concrete items were up front as an example, because I think that the sixth African region, the naming of that and the inclusion of African descendant communities in the global narrative coming out of the AU is important. I think for a long time, there was, this is something that I alluded to earlier, right? It was almost a strained relationship between continental African countries and peoples and diaspora. And I don't think that's something that we created. I think it was something that was imposed upon us. Narratives about Africa that were not popular, the ways in which our media continues to kind of exploit, right? And I won't talk about Tarzan and all that kind of stuff, but that's a part of this too, right? What has been exported in terms of film and media. So this conversation about development becomes incredibly important because there was intentional underdevelopment of the continent, the extraction of resources with revenues not going back to the development of those countries, the ways in which colonized countries, both in the Caribbean and in parts of South America, I mean, this was colonized too, but we'll talk about that another day, that the experiences of African descendant people in these contexts have been overshadowed, if you will, by a North American reality in the region. So you have Canada, US, predominantly white, Mexico, predominantly mixture of indigenous and colonized people. And then you have all this Blackness in the Caribbean, right? For many of these countries, tourism has become the primary way of sustainability. But we know that that's dependent on Europe and in part North America in order for survival to happen. So hearing about ways in which communities are reclaiming abilities to even export product, right? To function around trade agreements. This is important because the ability to have access to things that we're talking about, whether it's healthcare, education, and all of those kinds of things, are dependent on an infrastructure that quite often is absent, because when the colonial regimes left, they basically left us with very little. I want to frame some of this and just talk a little bit about the Caricom reparations plan, which talks about pretty extensively about reparations, right? But not just reparations in terms of financial. One of the things that it points to is the fact that at second emancipation, which people call independence in the Caribbean, more than 50% of the people were uneducated, right? That is significant, because if people are not educated, then their ability to function in certain spheres is limited. Our ability to self-govern and so forth and so on. So I think the inclusion of this sixth region, I think, begins to move us into talking comprehensively. So it's that comprehensive narrative that I'm talking about, where we're not just talking about what happens in the Caribbean or what happens in North America. We're talking together, and we're bringing in one voice, in a united voice to some extent. And we're saying, this is our collective witness and experience. These are our collective expectations. And most of all, I think what we're saying is that we understand that our future, our destiny is inextricably tied together, which is what Dr. King said.
Dr. Kara Georgia, thank you once again for your presentation. Let me just say, and I'm sure you alluded to it, but it certainly brought to my mind that within the last few months was the historic meeting between the AU and Caricom. And so there is this embrace that is actually having concretized actions to be in consultation with regions of people of African descent to say, what does this mean? Of course, we have a new ambassador who's come to Washington, also to really focus in on the Africa 2063 plan, even in the diaspora context relative to the AU as well. So thank you for making mention of all of what you said, but also particularly relative to Caricom as well. So Dr. Grushi, please, if we can hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to quickly pick up, there's a small controversy in the chat about whose mangoes are the best. Let me just say that the mangoes I had in Jamaica were the best. Let me just at least get that on the table so that I'm at least in some good company there. I think, forgive me, this is not an area of work that CWM is very much engaged with, but I think what we're exploring and what is being mooted by and developed by the AU is a reminder of what we were saying earlier, the economic roots of racism, and indeed the economic strategies that are needed to create the kind of solidarities that can bring lasting emancipation. Fundamental to that remains the question of reparation. I am glad to hear, this is something I had not heard about meeting with the AU and Caricom, because I am mindful of the break in Pan-Africanism that happened in Durban in 2001 over reparations between the African nations and Caricom. And I think that's a very welcome thing to hear. And I want to share with colleagues as a concern, and for reflection really, which I think to share even in our work around anti-racism and the legacies of slavery, that the vision of Pan-Africanism is certainly shifting, and it feels to us, to Black colleagues who are sharing this with me, that it is at risk. That we were at an event, for example, I remember earlier this year with Muta Baruka, who's a Rastafari dub poet. We were doing some artwork on legacies of slavery, and Muta Baruka said, don't think by making Jesus black, your Christ is any less Afrophobic. And whilst his comment was about systemic whiteness within Christianity, it had also to do, as he kind of broke it open, with the tensions of who names blackness and the struggles within Pan-Africanism because of how colonization and our systems continue to divide and rule in that respect. So, and that continues to be a concern as we address these questions in our own small little family, and why I'm so glad and grateful to hear both, not just of this kind of initiative within the AU, but the work WCC is doing to gather together African and diaspora African people together. It seems to me a really vital phase and another manifestation of the kind of, pushback that comes as liberation comes closer. So just to share those thoughts on that particular concern, perhaps as a friend.
Thank you, Dr. Gruchley. Let's move quickly to the Permanent Forum People of African Descent. This is a very new formulation built on the UN decade in solidarity with people of African descent and, the Commission relative to racism and all the things certainly that Dr. Day has been a part of. That has just happened in recent days. We know that on the 31st of August was the 20th anniversary relative to Durban. We know that at the UN Assembly, there was the adoption of the new resolution relative to United Against Racism that was also brought to the discussions at the Assembly that followed that 20th commemoration. We also know there were countries that were absent for the commemoration at the UN Assembly. So it didn't go without struggle as it did in Durban. However, all of that being said, the adoption of the Permanent Forum is going forward. And some of us are very blessed to be working on some of the pieces relative to how that moves forward, including yours truly. And I'm very interested to know what all of you will think about this next step in the journey, especially since Durban. And then we want to go quickly to the questions so that we make sure we get some responses from everyone that is in the room, although we have been doing that in the chat. So please be prepared for your questions, everyone. Make them, please. They'll be like 30 seconds or less. We'll try to group the questions and then we'll try to get them answered before we conclude shortly. So over to you, particularly Attorney Day, because you've been working in these areas, and then Professor Dr. Karen Georgia, and then also Dr. Gruchley. Thank you in that order, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really excited about the Permanent Forum. What we see it as, and we hope that this will be how it plays out, is a consultative space that will bring together, hopefully, primarily civil society to really hash out some issues, do some agenda setting, do some prioritization, and really inform mechanisms like ours, like the working group, as to how we can sort of jointly move forward and maximize our power through synergies. We see that there's never really enough focus on people of African descent. I mean, you're not necessarily making great strides towards dismantling systemic racism. I do think the Permanent Forum has a role there. It has turned out to be more of an expert forum than many of us had envisioned. And so we're going to see, we think, in weeks at the election of 5 members that will be stood by member states. And then we'll see 5 members appointed by the council as well. And so we have that, but we still expect to see 25 or more civil society who are funded to go to Geneva for the first, I think the first one's going to be in Geneva and then maybe New York. And then obviously, I think there's many organizations that can also send their own people on their own. And my great hope is that this will be an overwhelmingly civil society driven space where we can really push, I think, 2 things. One, to merely make sure that the Permanent Forum and the Durban mechanisms are really building together rather than fighting each other, which has been an expressed concern by civil society that certain countries' ambivalence around Durban might impact how the forum looks. I don't see any need for that. And then I think secondly, I think all of our mechanisms would do well to really build with the Permanent Forum because it's going to have such a robust and hopefully really diverse civil society voice that we haven't really had the opportunity for before to really dive into the meatiness of the agreements and disagreements we see that are both regional, developmental, and otherwise.
Thank you. Dr. Karen Georgia, please.
So I'm just gonna backtrack for 1 second, and I just wanna read. It says the United Nations decided in Resolution A-Res 73-262 to establish a permanent forum on people of African descent, which will serve as a consultation mechanism for people of African descent and other interested stakeholders as a platform for improving the quality of life and livelihoods of people of African descent, and to contribute to elaborating a United Nations declaration, which is the first step towards a legally binding instrument on the promotion and full respect of human rights of people of African descent, and that the modalities, format, and substantive and procedural aspects of the permanent forum will be concluded by member states and observer states with further consultation with people of African descent. That's a definition, right? And I'm thankful to Dominique for your comments, which encapsulate this very thing. But I didn't want to assume that everybody everybody here had heard or had read what the permanent forum is designed to do. I think it's important. It is incredibly important work that moves forward in the UN space, a particular body of work. I think a declaration is going to be incredibly important coming out of the decade and that work. And so the permanent forum in some ways extends the opportunities that are coming out of the decade, which is 2015 to 2024. Did I get that right? 2015 to 2024. And so what it says is that this body of work will continue under this guidance, right? That there's now a place to hold some of this important work. It's clearly not the only space, but I think coming up in the UN space, having this is going to be important as we continue to talk about how we get to that place of really development and impacting human rights and dignity for African descendant communities.
Thank you, Dr. Karen Georgia. And finally to you, Dr. Kruschli.
The news that the forum has been made permanent is really important news, and I was relieved to hear it, not least because I'm mindful coming from a nation, a citizen of a country that voted against recent UN recommendations around discrimination and hatred, and that the UK, alongside the US, alongside Canada, Australia, France, Germany, and Israel, voted against this statement. So to hear that this forum has been made permanent and the space is there to continue that fight is good news. It's also a reminder of the struggle that that does lie ahead, and for those particularly of you who are in that space, certainly to show you of prayers and solidarity, because what is becoming clear, I think, from a number of our critiques is how much of the decolonization work, of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, needs to kind of move again. And I think this is a space in which that decolonizing that space, the UN, that kind of global institution, could become a real and vital possibility. So I really hope that is the case, and certainly prayers and solidarity with those who will keep that space when there are so many pressures seeking to silence, hide, and prevent it.
Dr. Kruschli, thank you for that commendation. And to all of the panelists, thank you so much. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I wonder if the people who wrote the questions would be willing to offer the questions verbally very quickly. I see just a couple of them. You're welcome to speak verbally in this moment, I believe. We can do that. Is that right, Marcelo? They can offer their question verbally?
Yes.
Yes. So please feel free. Who would like to be that person?
But I have to upgrade them to panelists. So.
Okay. Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Can anyone see the names? I can't see the names. I can only see them in the chat. maybe I just call the names from the chat. Just
Yeah.
There's Patricia Bradley and Camilla McKellar who put questions in the question and answer.
Okay, is there a way for that we can hear them ask their
Yes.
questions?
I'm gonna promote Patricia now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Patricia is able to ask her question.
Patricia Bradley, Ms. Bradley, could you please ask her question quickly? Ms. Are you there? Can you ask your question quickly?
This is Patricia Bradley. I am a member and a promoter and supporter of the ADOS advocacy movement for reparations for those who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. And I am asking if any of you can comment on the ADOS movement to receive reparations exclusively for those descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States, set free during emancipation without any economic resources to start a new life and to survive economically. Many of them wound up going back to the plantations, becoming sharecroppers, and the impact is generational poverty that still resonates within today's generation of indigenous American descendants of slaves who are descendants of those who were specifically brought here during the colonial era of what would become the United States to be enslaved via the transatlantic slave trade era. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bradley. And let's go over to Ms. McKellar, please.
Sorry, good morning. I can't see my question, but my question is, as evidenced by this panel, Pan-African women, Pan-African people are in a struggle for our lives and existence around the world in each and everyone's own space. How do we create a more global conversation, Pan-African conversation in our communities? So how do we bring that lens into our community? What's the most effective way for us to make that happen?
Thanks to both of you for your questions. Thank you, Marcelo, for opening their mics. I'm going to go now to the panelists to respond. Whoever would like to respond, please feel free.
Maybe I'll start, if that's okay.
Certainly.
With respect to Patricia's question, Patricia Bradley's question, I think it's a really interesting one. This is one of the areas I see the Permanent Forum as offering some real space for dialogue and discourse. If you look at our last session, we held a session on environmental racism, the climate crisis, and people of African descent. And one of the things we did is have one of those authors of that study I referenced earlier that said reparations would have decreased the impact of COVID by 31 to 68% in the US. He sat on a panel we did on reparations, which also included members and Vereen Shepherd, who has been who's the director of the Center for Reparations Research in Jamaica, who's also been very instrumental in developing and promoting the Caricom 10-point plan that Karen Georgia referenced earlier. And these are not these two approaches are not fully consistent. And there was a very robust discourse in our session. It's webcast, so I would encourage people to go back and take a look at it. But I think the Caricom plan looks carefully at development from a global perspective. It has also been endorsed by our working group. I think the ADOS approach looks at African Americans as a discrete and insular group, and that the focus should be there by the American government, and that other mechanisms should look at reparations in other spaces. I mean, I'm kind of globalist in my approach. I said, I'm the chair of the working group. Ultimately, I feel like I've seen with my own eyes the common manifestations of anti-Blackness in very different spaces. But more importantly, perhaps, I do think something like the Permanent Forum will create some space for this conversation to happen and for some reconciliation or even where there is possibilities of harmonizing these views to move forward a bit. And I think it's a necessary conversation that needs to be happening, including pushing on the weaknesses or deficiencies or challenges of these different approaches. And we haven't had the space to do that, and that's not a small thing. And then very quickly with respect to the second question, I will say, and then hopefully this came clear in the slides that I shared, when we're talking about confronting systemic racism and the Pan-African approaches, I think we have to remember how invisible, how much of racism has been a function of teaching people to ignore it, right? Teaching people that it's in our minds, teaching people to deny it, teaching people that it's individual and not systemic. And I think a lot of what we can do in our individual local spaces is really highlight the stories that may be invisible, even to people who are experiencing them right next to us. The story I often tell as an attorney is going into court and being mistaken as a family court respondent, right? A mother accused of child abuse or neglect, being mistaken as a criminal court defendant, which has happened to every single Black or Latinx attorney I know. And yet, even the people in the room when that's happening, when the judge is saying, no, just the lawyers, stay back, even the people in the room when that's happening aren't noticing it if they aren't people of African descent, which is stunning, right? The filter of how we interpret racism as white noise extends even to what's happening in front of your own eyes. So uplifting these specific stories, helping to draw the connections between the racism that's happening in our spaces and the historical context that's enabling it, right? The enabling environment that persists. I think that's something we can do, and it works best to be doing it in our local spaces with specific examples and an ability to offer a framework that hopefully people can access on their own in the future if they are committed to really confronting their own bias, confronting their own complicity.
Thank you. Are there any very quick comments from the other two panelists, because we're at the end of our time, but thank you so much.
Yes, I just want to make a comment, particularly about the ADOS movement and really the movement for reparations. And I just want to bring into this conversation the fact that in many places, enslavers were compensated at emancipation. It happened in the British Empire, and it certainly happened here in the United States as well. I think that that needs to be a part of this conversation because that is a narrative that has been rendered invisible, right? So what does it mean that we compensated those who had enslaved individuals, but we gave nothing to those who had been enslaved? Clearly, again, whiteness on display. I think with the second, I would echo some of what Dominique had to say, and just name that a Pan-African lens requires a Pan-African story or stories. And here in the United States in particular, we have been taught about the African-American experience, which is fine, but it's also limited because we need to begin to expand the narrative to show the consistency of oppression here in this country and also globally. So we have to be intentional about reframing our educational process in our communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. Now over to you, Dr. Brushley, for the last word, if as it would be.
You cannot give me the last word, but let me just share a thing, a song or some words from minority white identity, British identity of Welshness, which can be black and white, of course. And it's a song called Yma o Hyd, and just the line, gwaith pawb a bopeth. Rana and Ama Ohid. Despite everyone and everything, we're still here. And for the Welsh who have tried to ensure their persisting identity through 900 years of English colonial occupation, that speaks to me in exactly the way that Dominique, Karen, Georgia, and you, Dr. Angelique, embody and envision and lead this space, this story, and these words. So despite everything, we are still here, and you are not bringing us to an end. So that for me is the spirit of this. I would certainly like to take from listening to you and to see in other spaces too. But I will not have the last word, so back to you or to somebody else.
Okay, thank you so much for that word. We are still here, and God has always been here and is the Alpha and the Omega. And together, we will continue to walk this great walk of faithfulness. We've come this far by faith, as the old song goes, and the African American church at least, and faithfulness is required. And that's certainly what we have sought to do in this moment. We are very pleased to have had this conversation. We thank you so much for the time you have spent to be with us for this very substantive conversation, this pre-conferencing. Yes, next Saturday, the 23rd of October, we will continue the journey together. I have put in the chat the email address of Sister Nono, who is helping us with the registration and interest for the furthering the conversation from the 23rd to the 29th. I encourage you to email her, tell her you were a part of this conversation and that you want to continue the conversation on the 23rd to the 29th. I promise you, by God's grace, that you will be blessed in those spaces as well. Thank you again for the honor to have served you today. And over to, I think Setma is on, so I think maybe she's going to give maybe a last comment, I'm not sure, or Dr. Fury. Otherwise, I believe my task is complete. Thank you so much.
Yeah, looking at
I'm sorry, Dr. Fury, it looks like you've gone frozen. I don't know. So maybe you can help us.
I think it's internet problem, connectivity problem. Oh, she's back.
Okay, come back to us. Okay.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for your contributions through the presentations, as well as those who participated through their questions. It was really eye-opening to be reminded that don't just look at what is happening now, but look at it in terms of history. There's a history of slavery, there's a history of colonialism, and there's a history of nationalism. So whenever something is happening, we need to reflect on it, through these eyes. And I want to thank you very much for storytelling, that, narratives are very important. We know that the history books are full of narratives of those who colonized us, but we need now to revisit those stories. I was particularly happy with the missionary stories, that Peter, shared, that, we need to revisit those stories because they affect our spirituality. They denied us of who we are, that, we are not a people without God. We've always been with God among us, and we need to emphasize that story. What I find missing is actually for Africa and Africans in the diaspora, emphasizing the fact that, we need to revisit the way we worship God and, embrace our African spirituality. We don't have to throw away Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is central to our identity as Christians, but we need our African spirituality, to be part of who we are. And thank you for mentioning the importance of education and of the economy, how it has operated to emphasize racism, but at the same time, we can use it to bring awareness of, where racism is happening, and to emancipate ourselves, from colonialism. I liked, what somebody had written in the chat, that there is a need for us to be decolonized, both the colonizer and the decolonized people. We need, to begin to revisit, those experiences. And I'm also grateful for what has been discussed about the 6th African nation, the Africans in the diaspora. What I don't understand, though, is why this has taken so many years and we are not going anywhere. So what do we need to do to make sure that the AU, takes this seriously? Unfortunately, we didn't have an AU representative, but we need to pursue this and ask questions why it's taking so long. And thank you so much, because indeed, at the end of the day, we can still say we are here, but we want a better life, because Christ came that all of us must have life in fullness. And where racism is, it's not fullness of life. Thank you. And thank you to my colleagues, for the work you've done to organize this meeting. Thank you to the interpreters, and also thank you to our communication staff. Thank you.
Dr. Fury, thank you. And of course, we would not be complete without a closing prayer. And so I'm going to call on Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia to offer that prayer, because she's clergy and she's like, oh, we do have a closing prayer to bring us. Dr. Fury, do we have someone assigned for the closing prayer, or do I ask Dr. Karen
You can
Georgia?
say it. You can say that.
Okay, all right. Dr. Karen Georgia, I've been requested to read it, so I will do so. Or Dr. Karen, either one of us can do it, but here we are. Here we are with the closing prayer. Oh God, our conversations today have revealed that we are gradually waking up to the knowledge of our deep and hidden sins, most particularly to the sin of racism, which has affected our culture, our psyche, and our practice. Sadly, we thought that we had leveled the playing field. We thought we didn't have to see color. But we know that we have more work to do to cleanse, to heal, and establish justice. Forgive us for quitting before the work was finished. Help us to see what we couldn't see before. Help us to examine everything, every custom and system, every group dynamic and assumption, to leave no stone unturned in our mission to rout out injustice, to take every thought to the loving ethic of Christ. Faithful God, as we do this, your work, which is often messy, which when we feel overwhelmed and ashamed, help us not to minimize or shrink, nor capitulate to our fragile egos, nor be blinded by our privilege. Give us robust hearts, willing to take on unflinching look even at our own hearts. And as we sift through our habits, our culture, our customs, and continue to examine them with a new sensitivity to injustice, help us to embody hope, peacemaking, and restoration. And above all, help us to have love for all. Help us to have love for all our neighbors. We pray in the name of Jesus, the one who embodies God's all-impressing love. Amen. And we thank the Reverend Fran Pratt in this adapted prayer that she offered. Amen and Ashe. Thanks to all.